Hello and welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is a show where every week I look at a book that was an influence to James Ellroy, a book that thrilled him, moved him, inspired him. Now, before I get onto the book for this week's show, hit that subscribe button. If I have a senior moment and forget to tell people, then I don't get many subscribers, but if I do remember, the subscribers go up, so hit subscribe and all the content will be delivered right to your inbox. Okay, our book for this week's show is Little Odessa by Joseph Koenig. So I'm going to say a little bit about Koenig, a little bit about the book, and then tell you about just a little story about Ellroy and Koenig. Okay, so not much is known about Joseph Koenig in terms of his biography. He's one of these authors of whom there's an aura of mystery surrounding him, and there's not many like that today. There used to be in the past like Salinger. Koenig is kind of like the Salinger of crime fiction. What we do know, most likely he was born in the 1950s. He was at least raised in New York. He was a really irascible, curmudgeonly, blunt New Yorker, in the best possible way. I love New York, I should point out. But he began work as his writing career was writing for true crime journals, detective magazines, and he covered some pretty dangerous cases. He went up to Providence, where he covered organized crime cases, and then he burst onto the crime writing scene with his first novel, Floater, which was nominated for the Edgar Award for Best First Novel. Then he really hit the big time with Little Odessa, his second novel, and this one is based in the Brighton Beach area of New York, which was a large, in the late 80s, a large Russian-American community, Jewish-Russian community, and the plot concerns a stripper as our lead character, Kate Pero. She was born in the Soviet Union. She's a Russian-Jewish stripper. She's a hard-working gal. She's really made it to the top. She's basically running the club she dances at. And in the opening scene, she basically assaults a Nigerian diplomat who gets fresh with her. And she kind of falls under the wing of this cop, Stan, who clearly has feelings for her. And she kind of gets involved in an increasingly bizarre and sleazy set of circumstances. The man who runs her club is back in Israel. He calls her. He says he's been arrested. He wants her to get some nuclear materials out of a safe and bring them to her. There's also a caper about a man who's just recently released from prison who steals the club owner's dog, which is this beloved Russian wolfhound, and tries to ransom it. And I should say, sensitivity warning alert. No dogs are harmed in this story. If that's something you're really sensitive to, don't worry, you're not going to be upset by this story. So this, like the nuclear materials, the ransom dog, the cops who say they're FBI but they're not, the crooked cops, and then Russian diplomats who are actually gangsters. It all comes together in a really good and entertaining mystery thriller. And one that's really heavily steeped in the milieu, not just of New York, but specifically the Brighton Beach community. Because Brighton Beach was considered one of the very last communities because of the flood of Russian immigration it got in the 1980s, where you could walk the streets and it felt like almost like Little Moscow, Little Odessa, to be more precise, in that everybody was talking Russian. There was Russian restaurants, the Russian shops where all of the signs on the wall were Russian. And that's kind of like what Little Italy used to be like, or the German neighborhoods, Yorktown, or the Irish neighborhoods, until they kind of became very homogenized and very Americanized. Little Odessa, Brighton Beach, was one of the last, and it really brings out the, just the atmosphere of the place, decaying Coney Island and that sort of thing. So where Joseph Koenig went from here is he could have been one of the biggest stars of crime fiction. And critically speaking, he kind of was. He did another novel, Smuggler's Notch, where it sold kind of bad. He blamed a bad front cover on that. And then he did a fourth novel that was highly acclaimed called Brides of Blood, which was set in Iran, or Tehran, and had an Iranian detective. And that was a New York Times notable book of 1994, but it sold very few copies. I guess he fell or came a cropper of crime writers who wanted to push themselves, but he pushed himself into a kind of very non-commercial territory. Then he wasn't heard of again for 20 years. In fact, Sarah Wyman did a profile of him, in which he said, "What happened to this guy? He was the rising star. He was going to be one of the biggest crime writers of America. He just seems to have dropped off the planet." She wasn't able to get in touch with him to do an interview or a retrospective. Then in 2012, he pops up again with False Negative, which was a fun novel, kind of romp about a true crime writer. And that was published by Hard Case Crime. And the editor of Hard Case Crime, Charles Ardai, is a wonderful man. I've corresponded with him a lot, and I met him at the Edgars in 2024. He's brilliant, Charles, at getting these kind of older writers and bringing them back into print, giving them a forum again, and basically just making them famous again. So James Ellroy knew Joseph Koenig a little bit, and this is something I only found out when I was writing his biography. He hadn't been on my radar before that. I mean, I knew Ellroy knew Elmore Leonard a bit because of the photos, and I knew he was friends with Andrew Vax, who was actually kind of very similar character to Joseph Koenig. Ellroy knew Koenig a bit, and they were friends, and he admired Little Odessa because Little Odessa was just a big book, and Koenig, this was actually optioned for a movie, and apparently Koenig did very well in the movie deal. It was a big deal, and Demi Moore was interested in playing Kate Pero. Now, the movie never happened. There was a crime film called Little Odessa, released in 1994, but it's not connected in any way other than the fact that it was a crime film set in Brighton Beach. So sadly, the Joseph Koenig Little Odessa movie with Demi Moore never happened. A few years later, Demi Moore played a stripper in Striptease, which was a disaster for her career, and she kind of dropped off the map for a while. But people forget Striptease is based on a crime novel by Cole Hyason. So it was something that seemed like Demi Moore wanted to do, and she's a Jewish actress. She went to Fairfax High School, like Ellroy. She didn't graduate from Fairfax High, like Ellroy. And I didn't know to what extent Ellroy and Koenig were friends, because Ellroy didn't seem very keen on talking about him. I was just like, was this a falling out or something? But it later came out when I was rereading John Williams' Into the Badlands, which is a wonderful book about John Williams is a British author, British journalist and author, who went to America for 2 months and toured around America, sleeping in motels, interviewing crime writers in every city, usually in places like diners and places like that. He had a real Americana experience. He interviewed Eugene Izzy, I think one of the very few people who interviewed Eugene Izzy before his sad and bizarre death. Let's Google that cat. He interviewed Andrew Vax, and Vax drove him around Hell's Kitchen and gave him a tour of all the kind of seedier areas that make up Andrew Vax's book. And I met John when I was writing Ellroy's biography, because John had interviewed Ellroy a few times. He interviewed him for this book. He interviewed him on the Mystery Train, which is one of the it was a train full of crime writers that were taken, I think, from Paris to Grenoble, and it was a big thing. So he knew Ellroy. He'd interviewed him a few times. He'd interviewed him when he was with his first wife, and he said it was very interesting, the dynamic between them, because we don't hear much about that. And he said that when he was driving through America, traveling through America, he'd talk to these crime writers, and they'd be great. And then he'd mention to them, oh, I'm talking to James Ellroy, who was still kind of the new kid on the block. The LA Quartet had only just started, so he was merely making his name. And John said a lot of these writers would clam up when he mentioned Ellroy's name. It's like, oh, you're talking to Ellroy, are you? Oh, okay, interesting, good luck. But he said, then he met Ellroy, and he said Ellroy couldn't have been more charming. He was really charming and helpful. And Ellroy's very much like that. You can be afraid of him one moment, and then he'll charm in the socks off you the next. And Ellroy said to him, oh, you should interview Joseph Koenig. I'll help you set up the interview, and like I'll tell him you're going to interview him. It's, you know, be great. And he had a hand in that. And then Koenig is one of the last people he interviews for the book. He interviews him in the subway in New York, and they take a tour around Brighton Beach together. And he said Koenig was miserable. He's just a miserable guy who seemed to hate everything, but in a kind of charming, curmudgeonly way. And when John Williams said to him, "It's like, oh, I was speaking to James Ellroy about you. He really likes you. He likes your." You love Little Odessa, and he considers you a friend." And Koenig's like, right. And he's like, "Well, who the hell is Ellroy? He calls himself my friend. I don't consider him a friend," and all this, and goes on this kind of bad-tempered rant. So the friendship didn't last long with Ellroy and Koenig, and trust me, Ellroy's a little bit prone to falling out, and he's often ditched people for far less reasons than that. But Koenig's career is really intriguing and enigmatic, and we have Little Odessa and a handful of other really great novels. Little Odessa is the one that sold, that could have made him a star. It's a kind of got this, really intoxicating mix of kind of Elmore Leonard and romp and Charles Willeford sleaze. And, he's written a handful of really, really acclaimed other books which are worth tracking down, like Brides of Blood, and then track down his comeback, False Negative, with Hard Case Crime. And he's a really, really interesting guy. Bit grumpy, but really, really interesting. Okay, thank you very much, and join us next week for another episode of Ellroy Reads. Okay, bye-bye.